Can you believe that an entire kingdom, forged in blood and fire, was once held hostage by the whims of a single spoiled man? This is not history as you know it. This is the truth of power, raw and terrifying, ripped from the dusty scrolls and amplified for the world to see. The secret history of how a few brave, desperate men dared to steal the sacred authority from God's chosen king, plunging England into an abyss of political betrayal and civil war, just to invent something we now call democracy. Forget gentle transitions and polite negotiations. The birth of Parliament was an earthquake, a catastrophe no one saw coming, and it was engineered by the most dangerous man in all of medieval Europe. Our story begins not in a hallowed hall of debate, but under the crushing weight of royal greed. By the 13th century, the Great Promise, the sacred vow of Magna Carta, signed decades earlier, had been systematically shredded by a king who believed he was literally above the law. King Henry III, a man of staggering vanity and even more staggering debt, saw the entire Kingdom of England not as a realm to govern, but as a personal piggy bank to smash open whenever his foreign wars or lavish tastes demanded it. Every tax, every levy, every forced loan was another shovelful of dirt piled onto the backs of his desperate subjects, from the lowliest peasant starving in the mud to the highest-ranking earl struggling to maintain his estates under the relentless financial drain of the crown. The wealth of England was flowing out of the country like a biblical flood, financing Henry's disastrous ambitions in Sicily and France, while the barons watched their own fortunes bleed dry. The king's court was infested with foreign favorites, imported from Poitou and Savoy, who were rewarded with titles and land, while native English lords were pushed aside, their honor and their power systematically eroded by this influx of outsiders who whispered dangerous advice into the king's ear. It was a calculated insult, a deliberate disenfranchisement that signaled one chilling truth. Henry III did not trust or respect his own people. The breaking point arrived with the sheer unbearable scale of the financial demands. Henry III was not just demanding money, he was demanding servitude, requiring the barons to pledge their estates and their lives to his impossible foreign schemes. Imagine the scene in 1258. The barons, the greatest warlords and landowners in the realm, arrive at Westminster, summoned by the king, expecting the usual round of groveling and subservience. Instead, they walked in clad not in courtly silks, but in full battle armor, their swords resting heavily at their sides. This was not a meeting, it was an armed intervention, a physical statement that the line of absolute obedience had finally snapped. The atmosphere was so thick with unspoken menace that you could practically taste the copper tang of impending violence. At the head of this furious assembly stood a man whose name would soon be whispered in terrified awe across the Channel: Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. De Montfort was no mere disgruntled nobleman. He was a brilliant military commander, a ruthless politician, and a former close confidant, even brother-in-law, of the king himself. This made his betrayal even more profound, his anger infinitely more dangerous. He understood the machinery of the state better than Henry, and he knew exactly where to strike to make the whole contraption collapse. He was a radical, a man driven by a fierce, almost religious belief that the king must be bound by the law, not merely above it, and that the suffering of the common man demanded immediate, revolutionary redress. De Montfort and his allies presented the king with the Provisions of Oxford, a document that, on its surface, seemed like a series of administrative reforms, but was in reality a bloodless constitutional coup d'état. These provisions demanded that Henry III surrender his executive power entirely, placing the governance of the entire kingdom, all finance, all justice, all appointments, into the hands of a council of 24 barons. The king, stripped naked of his authority, was forced to swear an oath, a humiliating public spectacle where the crown bowed to the collective will of the aristocracy. The barons didn't just want power, they wanted to fundamentally restructure the way England was ruled, creating a permanent, institutional check on royal authority for the very first time. This Council of 24 became the proto-government, the shadow regime operating outside the king's direct control, and it instantly created two irreconcilable factions that would soon tear the country apart. The king's supporters viewed this as monstrous treason, an affront to God's order. The barons viewed it as essential self-preservation, the only way to save England from financial ruin and foreign humiliation. But de Montfort realized something crucial. To truly bind the king, he needed more than just the barons. The barons were fickle, often motivated by self-interest, and could be bought off. To create a lasting revolution, he needed the people. He needed the sheer, terrifying weight of popular support to make the council's decisions irreversible. He needed to legitimize this new power structure by widening the circle of participation beyond the traditional feudal lords. This realization was the true tipping point, the ideological gunpowder that would ignite the ensuing war. De Montfort began to invite not just the great lords, but the lesser gentry, the knights from the shires, and, unbelievably, representatives from the great towns and cities. This seemingly small procedural change was the single most radical act in English political history up to that point. For the first time, individuals who were not high-ranking nobles, men who actually understood the grinding reality of local taxation and trade, were being given a seat at the table of national governance. This revolutionary gathering, a council of barons, knights, and burgesses, was the unholy incubator from which the monstrous, glorious thing we call Parliament would eventually emerge. Henry III, however, was not about to let his divine authority be dissolved by a committee. The oaths were quickly broken, the reforms were tossed aside, and the inevitable clash, the war that would decide whether England was ruled by one man or by a collective body, was about to erupt with unimaginable fury. Get ready, because the gloves are off. The armies are marching, and the first shot in the most consequential political battle in British history is about to be fired. The stage is set for the brutal civil war that would forge the future of the English-speaking world in blood. The air was thick with gunpowder, even before the first arrow flew. The man who sat on the throne, King Henry III, was not a monster of malice, but a victim of his own fatal, dizzying extravagance. He dreamed of vast, impossible empires, spending England's coffers on hopeless military campaigns in Sicily and France, squandering the wealth that his people desperately needed to survive the crushing medieval winter. His court, a glittering circus of foreign favorites, Poitevins and Savoyards, drained the treasury dry, treating the English land like a personal piggy bank ripe for smashing. The powerful barons, the true power brokers who had bankrolled the very crown he wore, watched in horror as their gold vanished into the pockets of French cousins and papal proxies, all while Henry ignored the sacred document, the Magna Carta, he had sworn on God's own cross to uphold. The final insult came in the form of a ridiculous, unbearable debt. Henry, desperate to fund his foreign fantasies, demanded an unprecedented tax levy, a staggering sum that threatened to bankrupt every major estate holder in the kingdom. This wasn't just taxation without consent. It was financial execution on a national scale, a clear sign that the king viewed their collective treasury as his own private emergency fund. The whisper networks of England's great lords, usually reserved for plotting against their neighbors, coalesced into a unified, lethal threat. They knew the king would never willingly stop, never honor the charter, and never cease his ruinous spending until the entire nation was bled dry. Drastic measures were required, and they found their leader in a man who was, ironically, once one of Henry's most trusted and deadly confidants. Enter Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a man whose very name would soon echo through the halls of history as both savior and seditionist, a charismatic radical whose ambition burned hotter than any forge fire. He was French by birth, yet more English in his revolutionary zeal than the Plantagenet king himself, having married Henry's own sister and tasted the bitter poison of royal failure. De Montfort was shrewd, ruthless, and absolutely convinced of his own divine mission to save England from itself. He saw Henry's catastrophic financial and political failures not as an opportunity for merely personal gain, but as a mandate to fundamentally restructure the very foundations of power, believing that only through collective oversight could the kingdom survive. He was the thunder in the storm, the catalyst that turned righteous, localized anger into organized, unified revolution. In 1258, the barons marched on Westminster, not with swords drawn in open war, but with a terrifying, unified demand, delivered in silence and supported by the weight of their combined armies. This was not a negotiation. It was a constitutional coup d'état delivered entirely on parchment, a silent seizure of the levers of government. They forced Henry, cornered and financially broken, to accept the infamous Provisions of Oxford. These provisions were a political execution dressed up as essential reform. They stripped the king of his absolute unilateral authority, replacing it with a permanent council of 15 barons who would oversee all royal appointments, control the treasury, and meet 3 times a year, a foundational step toward a permanent legislative body. The age of the absolute monarch was legally, if temporarily, dead and buried beneath the weight of aristocratic disapproval. Henry III was instantly reduced to a figurehead, a caged peacock whose magnificent, glittering feathers could no longer hide the fact that he was utterly powerless. Every major decision, every key appointment, every single penny spent now required the sign-off of the council. England was now ruled by an oligarchy of powerful lords, dedicated to protecting their own interests under the guise of national salvation and good governance. But power, once tasted, is rarely shared easily or for long. De Montfort, the brilliant architect of this new government, quickly began to dominate the Council of 15, finding his newly acquired authority insufficient to achieve his radical goals. He was impatient, dictatorial, and his vision extended far beyond merely balancing the budget. He wanted deep structural reform that threatened the liberties of the lesser barons just as much as Henry's tyranny had. His fellow barons, initially united against Henry's foreign favorites and financial recklessness, began to fear de Montfort's intense, uncompromising ambition, far more than the king's known incompetence. They realized they had replaced one capricious tyrant with a far more efficient, far more dangerous one who would tolerate no dissent. The political landscape fractured again, splitting the revolutionaries into warring factions, each eyeing the other with lethal suspicion and plotting their next move. Henry, weak but cunning in his desperation, saw his crucial chance for counter-revolution. He appealed directly to the Pope, the only higher authority recognized across Christendom, claiming that the provisions were illegally forced upon him and violated the divine contract of kingship established by God himself. Rome, always keen to support the principle of divine right and uphold established order, immediately responded by invalidating the provisions of Oxford, labeling them null and void. The moment the papal bull arrived, nullifying the revolutionary government and restoring Henry's fictional authority, the constitutional charade ended abruptly. It was a declaration of war disguised as a religious decree, a clear signal that the time for negotiation was over. De Montfort, refusing to yield the power he had fought so hard to secure, immediately mobilized his forces, proclaiming that Henry III and his foreign favorites had betrayed England and the spirit of the Magna Carta for the final time. The king, bolstered by the unwavering support of the established church and the conservative barons who feared de Montfort's creeping radicalism, raised the royal standard of war. The armies gathered, the loyalties were cemented, and the field was chosen. The year is 1264, and the brutal, defining conflict known as the Second Barons' War is about to consume England entirely, forcing men to choose between king and principle. The first shot has been fired, not just against a man, but against the very concept of absolute, unquestionable power. shattering the illusion of royal infallibility. The fate of the parliamentary system, the future rule of law, and the very soul of the nation now rested entirely upon the sharp, lethal edge of a medieval sword. The stakes could not be higher. The air in Westminster didn't just thicken, it curdled. King Henry III, who had reluctantly signed the crippling Provisions of Oxford, a document that effectively chained his hands and handed the keys of the kingdom to a council of 24 barons, was not a man built for submission. He saw not a constitution, but a humiliation, a temporary restraint he intended to snap like brittle winter ice. He watched the new council, led by the fiercely ambitious and terrifyingly popular Simon de Montfort, dismantle his court piece by bloody piece, purging the foreign favorites and seizing control of the royal appointments. The crown's ancient divine authority was bleeding out onto the stone floors of the palace. The ink on the provisions was barely dry before Henry began plotting the most monumental double cross in English history. A king is God's deputy on earth. To be ruled by mere subjects was an intolerable blasphemy, a stain that could only be washed clean in the blood of traitors. Who did Henry turn to when earthly oaths failed? To the ultimate authority, the Pope in Rome, the man whose word transcended mortal politics. Henry dispatched frantic, gold-laden messengers across the continent, begging Pope Urban IV to declare the Provisions of Oxford null and void, an illegal, sacrilegious constraint on a divinely appointed sovereign. The Pope, always keen to assert papal supremacy and unwilling to see a European monarch humbled by his own vassals, predictably sided with the king. The declaration arrived in England like a thunderbolt hurled from heaven itself. The oaths were void, the council was illegal, and absolute power was instantly restored to the monarch, bypassing all earthly contracts. This papal annulment was not merely a political maneuver, it was a religious weapon, a spiritual cannon fired directly at the hearts of the rebellious barons. It was a chilling pronouncement that echoed throughout every cathedral and parish. Defy Henry, and you defy God himself, condemning your immortal soul to eternal damnation. Montfort and his allies were instantly transformed from legitimate constitutional reformers into excommunicable mortal enemies of the Church, stripped of spiritual protection and worldly legitimacy. The line had been drawn not just by politics, but by divine judgment, and it was soaked in holy water and the chilling certainty of war. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a man whose piety was as intense as his ambition, received the news not with despair, but with a cold, terrifying resolve. He argued that the provisions, being for the common good of the realm, superseded even the Pope's interference in temporal affairs. He knew the talking game was over. Documents were worthless parchment. Only steel could purchase true freedom now. Montfort immediately rallied his faction, a coalition less of traditional high-born nobles and more of radical knights, frustrated gentry, and, crucially, the newly politicized and violently loyal citizens of the key towns. London, that magnificent, chaotic heart of commerce and anti-royalist sentiment, threw its immense wealth, its formidable trained bands, and its violent population behind the rebellion. The city gates closed against the crown, turning the capital itself into the revolutionary headquarters. This was no typical baronial quarrel over land titles or feudal dues. This was an ideological civil war for the very soul of governance. Montfort, a master of propaganda, framed the fight not as a power grab, but as a righteous crusade to save England from corruption, tyranny, and the ruinous influence of the king's despised foreign favorites. That narrative resonated like a battle drum with the common folk, who were weary of perpetual financial exploitation and the indignity of being governed by Parisian courtiers and Poitevin hangers-on. The rebellion swelled into a genuine popular movement, unseen in generations. The royal treasury, already gutted by Henry's endless continental wars and extravagant spending on his queen's French relatives, was a gaping maw of debt. Both sides were financially desperate, forcing ruthless seizures and emergency taxation that further polarized and radicalized the populace. Henry's royalists, bolstered by mercenaries pouring in from France and the continent, looked invincible on paper, relying on heavy armored cavalry and the presumed loyalty of the institutional power structure, the sheriffs, the bishops, and the official state machinery. Their banner flew the promise of restored order and brutal repression. Montfort's army, however, was lean, driven by ideological fervor, and shockingly disciplined. He drilled his troops not just in traditional mounted combat, but in coordinated infantry maneuvers and the use of the formidable longbow, a modern, deadly approach that shocked and often decimated traditional feudal commanders. Every village, every crossroads became a potential battlefield. The tension was palpable across the kingdom. Citizens barricaded their doors, stockpiling meager supplies, knowing that when these two monstrous forces finally collided, the resulting storm would tear the nation apart and decide the fate of their children. The two armies marched toward inevitable, catastrophic confrontation. Henry III, leading his formidable and ruthless son, Prince Edward, moved south from Oxford, confident in their numerical superiority and the divine righteousness granted by the Pope's annulment. They sought a swift, decisive blow to crush the traitorous Earl. Montfort, calculating every movement like a grand master, maneuvered brilliantly, utilizing the terrain and his local knowledge, intentionally drawing the royalists into a place of his choosing, a place where their cavalry advantage would be negated. The target? The strategically vital town of Lewes in Sussex. Lewes was not just a town, it was a choke point. The royalist forces, encamped near the vast, secure priory and the town castle, felt secure, perhaps tragically too secure. They were about to learn that security was a fatal illusion when facing an enemy driven by revolutionary, existential zeal. Montfort issued his final electrifying call to arms. They were fighting not for titles or lands, but for the fundamental right of Englishmen to govern themselves by law, not by the whim of a single man. For the rule of law, for the future of a free nation. The die was cast. The morning mist over the Sussex Downs was about to witness either a constitutional murder or the bloody, agonizing birth of a revolutionary system of collective governance. The stakes could not be higher. The sun rose not on a peaceful negotiation, but on the stench of fear and wet steel pooling across the Sussex fields. King Henry III, convinced by the divine mandate he held, had amassed an army of royalists so vast as to question God's chosen representative. Montfort, however, was not just fighting for a document. He was fighting for the very soul of the realm. Fueled by the desperate fury of the barons and the common people, the forgotten souls, whom Henry's greed had bled dry. The royalist commanders, drunk on misplaced confidence, expected a quick routing, a glorious slaughter before noon, believing the sheer spectacle of their numbers would shatter the will of the revolutionary forces instantly. But Montfort, the grizzled, relentless veteran of the Crusades, had played a deeper game. He understood that a desperate man fights harder than a comfortable one, and he had orchestrated his forces not just as soldiers, but as ideological fanatics. He had ordered his men to wear white crosses sewn over their tunics, turning the impending battle into a holy crusade against tyranny, injecting a religious fervor into the ranks that money could not buy. This was not merely a military skirmish. It was a sacred commitment spreading through the common ranks, convincing every peasant soldier that his death would be a glorious martyrdom for the concept of justice and the true spirit of the Magna Carta. While the king's son, the fiery Prince Edward, charged ahead with aristocratic fury, seeking to prove his martial prowess and crush the rebellion's heart, he made a critical, fatal error of overzealous pursuit, blinded by arrogance. Edward, focusing his entire cavalry might on Montfort's left flank, a maneuver that initially seemed brilliantly successful as the initial rebel lines scattered, drew his elite forces too far from the main royalist body, leaving his father, the king, disastrously exposed and undefended. It was the classic hubris of absolute power, believing the enemy was already defeated, simply because they had momentarily retreated. Montfort saw the gap, the gaping, fatal constitutional wound in the royalist line, and seized it with the speed of a viper striking a sleeping victim. He held back his core reserve, consisting of the hardiest, most ideologically pure knights, waiting for the exact psychological moment when Henry III, seeing his heir disappear into the distance, pursuing glory, would realize he was isolated on the battlefield and facing true mortal danger. The king's standard, the magnificent golden dragon of England, suddenly looked forlorn against the skyline, transforming instantly from a beacon of royal command into a terrifying, solitary target. The ensuing chaos was absolute, a maelstrom of confusion and betrayal as the rebels surged forward with terrifying cohesion. The barons who had previously been hesitant or secretly loyal to Henry now saw their chance to reclaim their dignity and their stolen wealth. They abandoned their posts, or worse, turned their blades on their former comrades, realizing that fortune favored the audacious revolutionary. The confrontation meant to be the quick execution of the constitutional dream, devolved instead into a nightmarish, bloody rout for the crown, shattering centuries of perceived invincibility. When the fog of war finally cleared that agonizing afternoon, the constitutional earthquake had struck, leaving the ruling structure in ruins. King Henry III, the man who believed he was chosen by divine grace and answerable to no mortal man, was captured and disarmed, his magnificent robes stained with the mud of defeat. His brother, Richard, the wealthy Earl of Cornwall, and absurdly titled King of the Romans, suffered an even greater humiliation. He was cornered and imprisoned in a rudimentary windmill, a truly symbolic fall from grace for the man who epitomized lavish, wasteful royal spending. The crown was effectively decapitated, politically and physically, and the immense, terrifying power of England suddenly rested not on the head of an anointed monarch, but solely in the ruthless, calculating hands of one man, Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. He had not just won a skirmish, he had fundamentally inverted the constitutional order, achieving what generations of cautious, conservative barons had only whispered about. He held the king as his personal hostage, and through that captive king, he held the entire nation in his iron grip. This was not true liberty yet. This was the chilling reality of absolute control wielded by a revolutionary dictator who merely wore the mask of a reformer. Montfort immediately implemented the radical Mise of Lewis, an agreement dictated under duress that stripped the crown of all meaningful executive authority and transferred total power to a new council meticulously controlled by the victorious Montfort himself and his most loyal adherents. But a man who overthrows a king often struggles desperately to govern the subsequent peace. The very tools Montfort had used to curb royal tyranny, absolute control, military force, and unwavering ideological certainty, began inexorably to turn against him, poisoning his legitimacy. He was now the ultimate authority, ruling through a puppet monarch, and the insidious whispers of tyrant began to replace the glorious, heroic shouts of savior among the very barons who had fought so fiercely beside him only days before. The price of rescuing England from one king's greed seemed to be immediate subjugation to one highly dangerous earl's blinding ambition. Montfort knew he needed a broader base of support, a level of national consent that even his baronial allies couldn't provide, and he needed it fast, before the captive Prince Edward could somehow rally the fragmented remnants of the royalist fury and attempt a catastrophic rescue. The constitutional experiment had miraculously survived. The constitutional experiment had miraculously survived the king's brutal wrath, only to face the far more insidious internal threat of the dictator's overwhelming hubris. Montfort realized he had to do something unprecedented, something so radical and encompassing that it would solidify his grip on the nation and forever baptize his revolutionary rule in the fire of genuine collective national consent. The stage was set, not just for political maneuvering, but for the ultimate political innovation, a desperate final gamble that would forever change the very definition of English power, ushering in a dark new age of ruthless governance. When the dust settled, the crown of England had not been replaced, but it had been shackled. King Henry III, once the divine representative of God on earth, was now little more than a gilded hostage, his royal signature coerced onto documents drafted by the man who had stolen his kingdom, Simon de Montfort, the ruthless Earl of Leicester. This wasn't just a change of government, it was a constitutional coup d'état carried out in the name of liberty, yet fueled by the dictator's blinding ambition. The entire nation watched, terrified, wondering if the cure was far worse than the original disease. De Montfort knew that power seized by force is flimsy, built upon sand and the fleeting loyalty of mercenaries. To truly cement his unprecedented rule, he needed not only the illusion of national consent, a temporary shield of legitimacy, but more crucially, he needed money, an ocean of it, to pay for the war he knew was coming from exiled royalists across the continent. The barons were tired, the clergy were suspicious, and the royal coffers were empty. He had to widen the net, drawing in new, pliable sources of support that the old regime had always contemptuously ignored. This desperate need for both validation and revenue led directly to the most radical, earth-shattering political move of the entire century, the summoning of the Great Council in January 1265. This assembly was unlike any that had come before it. It was not enough to call the standard roster of earls and high-ranking bishops. Montfort, in a stroke of genius or sheer desperation, reached lower, into the forgotten strata of the realm, daring to challenge the established hierarchy of medieval power. For the very first time, he commanded that representatives from the shires, the local knights, and, most unbelievably, representatives from the major towns and boroughs, the wealthy burgesses, be summoned to Westminster. These were the people who actually paid the most devastating taxes, who manned the local militias, and whose voices had historically been silenced in the grand halls of power. They were suddenly standing, physically, in the heart of government. This was not the king's parliament, the assembly of the elite. This was Montfort's parliament, his desperate, calculated gamble for validation, and perhaps more importantly, a reliable mechanism for squeezing the lifeblood out of the English economy. It was the birth of the modern representative body, forged not by idealism, but by the cynical necessity of revolutionary financing. The irony was poisonous, thick in the air of Westminster Palace. The man who had risen to power, decrying royal tyranny, quickly began to embody it. His rule became arbitrary, his taxes crushing, and his promises of true collective reform withered instantly under the immense weight of his personal ambition. He had promised shared governance, but he ruled through a small, fierce council of loyalists, hoarding all significant decisions and key appointments for himself and his immediate family. His alliances began to fray dramatically, tearing at the very seams of the rebel coalition. The powerful and mercurial Earl of Gloucester, Gilbert de Clare, a critical partner in the initial bloody uprising against King Henry, realized with dawning horror that they had merely traded one master for another, a legitimate crowned lion for an uncrowned, power-mad wolf. The financial burden Montfort levied was unbearable. He taxed wool exports ruthlessly, increased fines on towns that showed resistance, and squeezed every last penny from the already struggling merchant class, all while preparing for the inevitable royalist counterattack that he knew would come. De Clare began to whisper treason, meeting in the deepest shadows of his castles, exchanging coded letters that meticulously detailed the terrifying dictatorial path Montfort was leading the country down. The former allies had become mortal enemies, separated by the horrifying realization that Montfort's vision of government was not about shared responsibility or true constitutional liberty, but about his own supreme, utterly unchallenged authority. The magnificent, revolutionary structure of the 1265 Parliament was crumbling before it could even properly set its roots, dissolved by the very dictator who had summoned it into existence. It was a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds until the inevitable explosion of renewed, devastating civil war, fueled by paranoia and mounting debt. The centerpiece of the royalist revival, the single individual whose return guaranteed Montfort's destruction, was Prince Edward, King Henry's cunning, terrifying, and ruthlessly effective heir. Though he was held under Montfort's strict, stringent supervision, Edward was a predator waiting for the slightest mistake, concealing his genius beneath a mask of compliance. His captors, lulled into fatal complacency by months of monotonous surveillance and Montfort's overconfidence, fatally underestimated Edward's patience and strategic mind. The escape itself was a masterpiece of theatrical deception, staged outside Hereford Castle. Under the guise of exercising horses, Edward staged a series of races, cleverly exhausting the best mounts of his unsuspecting guards in a prolonged display of sporting enthusiasm. When the perfect, calculated moment arrived, a swift, brutal movement occurred. Edward vaulted onto a fresh, powerful horse supplied by a secret, embedded loyalist, leaving his baffled, humiliated jailers choking on the dust of his terrifying speed. A signal flare, bright and triumphant, shot into the evening sky, marking the immediate return of the true royal lion to the hunt. Edward was free, and his freedom instantly galvanized the scattered, terrified royalist forces across England and Wales. The balance of power, so heavily weighted towards Montfort for almost 2 years, shifted instantly and violently, like a massive ship capsizing in a sudden catastrophic storm. Montfort, believing himself safe and secure in his forced governance, suddenly found himself facing a nightmare scenario. A united, vengeful army, led by the most strategically brilliant military mind in the kingdom, the future King Edward I. The time for political maneuvering was brutally over. The time for absolute, decisive, and bloody war had begun again, promising the final, terrifying confrontation for the soul of England. The war machine of Edward I roared to life, a terrifying, unstoppable engine of conquest that promised glory to the crown, but delivered only economic devastation to the realm. This was not just a military campaign. It was a black hole of finance, demanding unprecedented quantities of gold to fuel the endless sieges of Wales, the brutal subjugation of Scotland, and the exhausting entanglements with the French king across the narrow sea. The promises made on the fields of Runnymede, the very notion of limited monarchy, were instantly swallowed by the king's insatiable hunger for conquest and the gargantuan pet machine he created. The royal vaults were not just empty, they were screaming in anguish. Edward I, the ruthless hammer, found himself perpetually shackled by the very wars that defined his reign. He had bled the Jews of England dry, leading ultimately to their traumatic expulsion in 1290. And now he turned his predatory gaze upon the wealthy Italian banking houses, the Frescobaldi and the Riccardi, piling debt upon debt until the crown's solvency was a sick joke whispered in European courts. To service this crippling burden and finance yet another destructive campaign, Edward was forced into the most cynical and revolutionary constitutional gamble in English history. He needed cash, and he needed it fast, and the traditional assemblies of great barons simply couldn't squeeze enough from the land to satisfy him. Edward needed to reach deeper, into the purses of the knights, the merchants, and the common people, the vast, untapped reservoir of English wealth. In 1295, born not of democratic ideals, but of sheer tyrannical financial desperation, the king summoned what history would later call the Model Parliament. It was a grotesque assembly designed solely for extortion through the illusion of consensus. For the first time, Edward gathered the great lords, both spiritual and temporal, alongside representatives of the lower clergy, 2 knights from every shire and 2 burgesses from every major town. This was the king's genius, to bring those who held the actual wealth, the mercantile class, the local gentry, into the political arena, not as partners in governance, but as prey to be taxed into submission. Edward's cold calculus was simple. If they agreed to the subsidy, even under duress, they could not later claim the tax was illegal. The king sought acquiescence, not advice, demanding money for his wars to save the very soul of England, or so the rhetoric claimed. The trap worked initially. Money poured in, but the demands never ceased. Year after year, the financial knife twisted tighter. By 1297, the breaking point was reached. Edward, gearing up for a disastrous war in Flanders, demanded yet another massive subsidy, known as the Aid, along with an arbitrary wool tax, a maltote, without any pretense of consulting his magnates or the gathered commonalty. This was a direct, arrogant violation of the spirit of the Magna Carta, a betrayal so blatant that even the most loyal barons recoiled. A terrifying coalition formed, led by the Earl Marshal Roger Bigot and Humphrey de Bohun, Constable of England. They refused to serve in Flanders, and, crucially, they refused the tax. Their defiance echoed through Westminster Hall. No taxation without due consent. Edward I, the terrifying warlord who had crushed Wales and Scotland, was cornered by two defiant noblemen and the sheer weight of his own financial tyranny. His response was characteristic fury. He threatened, he swaggered, he demanded absolute obedience under the divine right of the crown. But Bigot and Bohun held the line, supported by the terrifying reality that the entire mercantile class was ready to revolt against the arbitrary taxes. Edward, facing a military campaign abroad and a full-scale constitutional revolution at home, was forced to swallow the bitterest political poison. In his absence, while campaigning disastrously in Flanders, his regents were compelled to issue the Confirmatio Cartarum, the confirmation of the charters. This was the moment the ancient documents were resurrected and given lethal new power. The Confirmatio Cartarum was a revolutionary concession. It not only reaffirmed the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, but it added a monumental new clause. The king could levy no tallage or aid without the consent of the entire realm. This single act cemented the principle of parliamentary control over the purse strings, transforming the assembly of taxpayers into the necessary source of legal authority for royal finance. The knights of the shire and the burgesses, the commons, were suddenly elevated from mere petitioners begging for favors to essential, unavoidable partners in state finance. They held the economic leverage, and the king, despite his divine claims, could no longer ignore them. Edward I, upon his return, was livid. He spent the remainder of his life twisting, turning, and attempting to revoke these forced concessions, asserting that promises made under duress were void before God. But the genie was out of the bottle. The financial crisis had created a permanent, legitimate platform for collective governance. When Edward I finally died, leaving his fragile, deeply compromised throne to his disastrously weak successor, Edward II, the unified Parliament stood ready. They had tasted leverage. They understood their indispensable power, and they would use it not just to control the king's money, but soon enough to control the king himself. The air in Westminster did not merely thicken, it became a toxic, suffocating fog of mutual suspicion. King Henry III, the supposed champion of God's will, found the chains of the provisions of Oxford biting deep into the divine flesh of his authority. Every penny requested, every appointment made, had to pass through the cold, judging eyes of Simon de Montfort's baronial council, an assembly known for its ruthless efficiency and utter lack of deference.
This was not kingship, it was captivity disguised as governance, and Henry's royal blood boiled with a hatred that only a humiliated absolute ruler can know. He knew he could not simply wait for the storm to pass, hoping the restless barons would eventually tire of ruling. He needed a lifeline, a source of power so absolute, so untraceable, that the grubby local English magnates could never touch it, a foreign leverage that would crush internal dissent beneath its weight. His gaze, desperate and avaricious, turned across the English Channel, landing squarely on the ultimate power broker, the spiritual sovereign, the Vatican. Rome, the source of divine legitimacy, was also a limitless source of cash, provided the price was high enough and the venture sufficiently insane. A desperate, hushed negotiation began, the kind of clandestine dealing that smells of frankincense and the stench of impending national ruin. Henry III made a pact with Pope Alexander IV, a truly Faustian bargain for a crown made of air and a debt made of lead. The Pope offered the completely unachievable crown of Sicily to Henry's younger son, Edmund Crouchback, a political prize entirely out of reach and impossibly expensive to secure against rival powers like the Hohenstaufens. The cost to England? An astronomical sum of 135,000 marks. A debt so crushing it would bankrupt the entire kingdom just to pay the interest, let alone finance the invasion required to secure the title. When Parliament, still believing they controlled the national purse strings, finally pieced together the details of this monstrous secret loan, the Sicilian adventure, the betrayal was palpable, shattering the fragile peace like a hammer blow to expensive stained glass. Henry had used the Pope's unquestionable spiritual authority to bypass every single constitutional safeguard put in place by the barons at Oxford. He had mortgaged England's future, its solvency, and its honor, all for a fantasy title for his son, proving that his word, even sworn on the most sacred relics, meant nothing. This was not merely fiscal irresponsibility. This was an act of war by financial suicide, demonstrating beyond all doubt that the king viewed the provisions of Oxford and the Magna Carta itself as mere temporary irritations, scrap paper to be discarded the moment outside leverage was secured. Then came the final, crushing legal blow that rendered all constitutional arguments moot. Pope Alexander IV, in exchange for Henry's promises and guaranteed payments, issued a devastating papal bull in 1261, an official, spiritual decree that sent a chill through every manor house and every commoner's heart that valued liberty. This treacherous document formally absolved Henry III of the binding oath he had sworn just 3 years earlier to uphold the hated provisions of Oxford. The commitment, taken on the cross, under the watchful eyes of God and the entire peerage, was nullified by fiat from Rome. Tyranny now wore the terrifying mask of divine endorsement. The king was legally, spiritually and financially free to revert to his absolute, terrifying power, claiming that his actions were sanctioned by the highest authority on earth. He immediately expelled every single baronial official, seizing the keys to the impregnable Tower of London, dismissing the Parliament-appointed justiciar, and sending the carefully constructed machinery of shared governance crashing into the dust. The newly minted English Constitution was dead. The rule of the absolute royal sword had returned, faster and sharper than before. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, the man who had authored this temporary and ultimately futile peace, did not hesitate. His face, usually set in the stern mask of a dedicated reformer, was now contorted by righteous, absolute fury, a holy rage against betrayal. He knew this moment defined not just his personal fate, but the entire trajectory of the English nation. There was no going back to the table. Montfort, a complex and dangerous leader, immediately rallied his loyalists, the disaffected barons, the powerful gentry, and, crucially, the desperate, tax-burdened citizens of major towns like London, who saw in Montfort a champion against endless royal avarice. He offered them something Henry never could: principle over personality. His rallying cry was not just for the provisions of Oxford, but for the inherent right of the community of the realm to hold the king accountable. This was not a revolt against a bad policy. It was a revolution against the very concept of unchecked, oath-breaking monarchy. The barons, having failed to chain the king with parchment, now reached decisively for steel, preparing for the inevitable bloodletting. By 1263, the Second Barons' War was no longer a threat whispered in smoky back rooms. It was a brutal reality tearing England limb from limb. A war of ideals fought across the green fields of the realm. De Montfort moved with the strategic brilliance of a seasoned general and the religious fervor of a fanatic, securing the crucial southeast and isolating the king's strongholds along the coast. He used the rivers and ports as highways for his influence, ensuring that his message and his army traveled faster than the king's reactionary forces. Henry III, relying heavily on foreign mercenaries and the increasingly capable military mind of his son, Prince Edward, retreated to the fortified safety of London and Oxford, desperately trying to maintain the outward facade of control over a kingdom rapidly slipping into anarchy and civil disobedience. Every castle seized, every town that declared for the baronial cause, was a bloody testament to the king's profound and fatal failure of trust. The parliamentarians were fighting for their lives, knowing that defeat meant not just execution, but the absolute end of any constitutional checks on the crown forever. The stage was now meticulously set for the ultimate showdown, a bloody reckoning that would determine whether the future of England lay in the hands of one crowned man who defied God's promises, or in the collective, dangerous ambition of a revolutionary political body. The year 1264 loomed, promising judgment, devastation, and the final, terrifying confrontation that would change the trajectory of Western constitutional history forever. The fate of the entire system rested on the coming clash of armies.
The air was thick, not just with the stench of unwashed armies, but with the suffocating, inevitable scent of failure that now hung heavy over the revolutionary cause. Simon de Montfort, the self-crowned architect of English liberty, had committed the cardinal sin of every rising dictator. He had underestimated the captive prince, believing the Plantagenet viper was safely caged. Edward, the heir apparent, the coiled menace of the royal line, was never meant for imprisonment. His escape was less a clandestine flight and more a meticulously planned, devastating political earthquake that instantly obliterated the fragile foundations of Montfort's shaky rule. The prince, cunningly feigning illness and demanding a series of high-energy horse exercises, ran his mounts to sheer, agonizing fatigue, masking his true intention until the moment of reckoning arrived. When he finally vaulted onto the back of a fresh, powerful charger and galloped away from his unwitting guards at Hereford, the clock started ticking rapidly down to zero for the entire revolutionary experiment. Edward was not merely seeking vengeance for his family's humiliation. He was hunting the complete, systematic destruction of the very idea of Parliament itself. He proved himself a strategic genius, cold and calculating, utterly unlike his financially reckless and impulsive father, King Henry III. Edward vanished into the treacherous Welsh marches, immediately linking up with the disaffected Marcher lords, powerful barons who had seen Montfort's quasi-parliament not as glorious liberation, but merely as a new, equally rapacious form of tyranny, demanding endless, crippling taxation. The political landscape twisted violently, accelerating toward catastrophe. Montfort, convinced of his absolute control over the machinery of state and the very person of the king, suddenly found himself staring down a galvanized, heavily armed counterforce backed by the relentless financial engines of the Loyalist faction. Worse still, Montfort's own coffers were bone dry, drained by the immense, impossible demands of simultaneously maintaining a massive wartime army while trying to fund a functioning, legitimate government centered in Westminster. The promise of a better tomorrow, once so compelling to the lesser gentry and the commoners, now rang terrifyingly hollow against the sound of empty purses and the constant, insidious murmur of baronial betrayal that spread through his ranks. Edward knew exactly how to exploit this financial desperation. His strategy was simple and ruthless. Isolate the general, crush the supply lines, and eliminate the hope of reinforcement. Montfort was quickly becoming trapped, geographically and politically, cornered between the swirling currents of the River Severn and an enemy that moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed. The prince executed a brilliant maneuver, using a flanking force to intercept and crush Montfort's primary supply chain, and the desperately needed reinforcements being led by Montfort's own son, young Henry de Montfort. The younger man, riding toward his father's position, with banners proudly flying, suddenly found himself having walked straight into the deadliest ambush ever sprung on English soil. The battle that ensued, a massacre disguised as a skirmish at Kenilworth, left Henry's entire division scattered, demoralized, or dead, eliminating Montfort's last and final hope of numerical superiority. This was not war. It was the clinical, meticulous execution of political ideals, carried out with the utmost brutality, guaranteeing a final defeat. Simon de Montfort, the elder, was now utterly alone, awaiting news in the small, unassuming town of Evesham, a quiet place that would soon be stained scarlet by the final bloody act of this revolutionary tragedy. He did not know his son had already fallen into the royalist trap. On August 4th, 1265, the world truly stopped turning for the cause of collective governance. Edward's forces approached Evesham under the deepest pretense of friendship, flying captured Montfort banners high above their heads. A deception so cruel, so effective, it guaranteed the shock and utter destruction of the parliamentary forces, who mistook the vanguard for their own relief. When Montfort finally realized the devastating truth, looking out over the fields and seeing the disciplined, familiar standard formations led by royalist knights, he allegedly whispered the grim final prophecy: "They have learned their lesson from me, and not of themselves." He knew instantly that his own tactical genius had been turned against him by his former pupil, the vengeful prince. The ensuing battle at Evesham was short, swift, and indescribably merciless. It was a slaughterhouse designed not just to win the war, but to send an irreversible political message to every baron, burgess, and commoner who had dared to stand against the divine right of the king. The royalists, fueled by years of financial humiliation, political imprisonment, and the fervent desire to completely erase the stain of the mad Parliament, fought with a terrifying, primal rage that knew no boundaries of chivalry or quarter. The common soldiers who had rallied to Montfort's radical call for justice were cut down indiscriminately, their cries for mercy drowned out by the thunderous clash of steel and the desperate, doomed roar of the handful of loyal barons fighting for their very survival. But the true focus of the royalist wrath was always Simon de Montfort himself. He fought like a cornered, magnificent lion, surrounded by the few remaining loyalists, realizing with grim certainty that there would be no quarter, no negotiation, only absolute, violent annihilation. When he finally fell, grievously wounded and bleeding out on the field, the royalist hatred transcended mere execution. It became an act of ritualistic dismemberment, a public declaration that the entire body of collective governance would be torn apart just as violently as the man who championed it. His body was mutilated beyond all recognition. His head was brutally severed and sent as a gruesome ultimate trophy to the wife of Roger Mortimer,
one of his fiercest and most powerful enemies, while his hands and feet were dispatched across the kingdom. A terrifying, visceral, and unforgettable warning against any future constitutional resistance.
The Father of Parliament was literally scattered across England, his physical presence erased, his revolution crushed. King Henry III was officially restored to absolute power, the rebellion neutralized, and the revolutionary threat seemingly ended.
The royal chroniclers declared it the end of the greatest political upheaval England had ever known. But they were tragically mistaken. The radical ideas that Montfort had unleashed, the necessity of consent, the power of collective representation, the demand for justice beyond the king's whim, were not things that could be killed by a sword.
They had seeped into the very soil of England, internalized by the surviving barons, waiting for the right moment, the right king, and the right financial disaster to rise again, ready for the next inevitable chapter of legislative warfare. The royal vengeance was complete, but the revolution had just begun its slow, terrifying incubation, waiting for the next crisis to erupt.